The fact that marijuana legalization is happening is because people sacrificed and suffered, like my husband who spent 5 years in a prison in a country he never went to, strictly for legalization activism. Our people, our community, our culture has been here for decades, and I've been demonized. We're second-class citizens. You can't travel to the U.S.
But I'm worried about the message that it gets to our youth, the hands that it gets into, and the overwhelming thought and or belief that there's nothing wrong with it and it has no ill side effects.
There are a lot of economic benefits associated with this. We are the first one to do it. That's a major Western economic power. And we happen to be doing this at a moment where the U.S., because of the Trump administration, looks like they're going backwards from a lot of progress.
They may or may not get arrested, but it is illegal. And when we suggest that they can cross the border...
That is exactly why it's
No, you may or may not get arrested for running the red light outside of our studio today also, but it's still illegal, so don't do it.
From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, the Zoomer with Marissa Semkiw.
Hello and welcome to the Zoomer. I'm Marissa Semkiw. Today we'll explore a smoking hot political issue, the legalization of pot in Canada. The Liberals promised legislation and in the meantime appointed a task force to hash out the details. The task force provided 80 recommendations to end the prohibition on pot, which dates back to 1923, including that the minimum age to purchase be 18 and that it be up to the provinces to control distribution and retail sales. Should the government choose to move forward, Canada will become the second country in the world to legalize the use, possession, sale, and cultivation of cannabis under federal law. There's a lot to discuss. I'm joined by an expert panel from activists to former addicts to help sift through the weeds. But first, let's tee up the topic.
In 2001, Canada became the first country to legalize medical marijuana. 16 years later, it's poised to take the next big step and legalize pot recreationally on a national scale. And the stats are in its favor. A recent national study conducted by Nanos Research showed that 7 in 10 Canadians favored legalization. Moreover, marijuana is the most commonly used illegal drug in Canada. Almost half, 44% of Canadians say they have used pot at least once in their lifetime. There's no denying the economic power of the pot industry. Consider Colorado, one of a handful of locales that have legalized in the U.S., which saw legal cannabis sales surpass $1 billion in 2016. Some might call that the jackpot. North of the border, financial experts are predicting a $22.6 billion industry, with as much as $5 billion going straight into government coffers. That's if the underground market is effectively curtailed. In the meantime, Prime Minister Trudeau has commissioned a task force to examine everything from the effects of health and roadside safety to criminal justice issues. Though no timeline has been set, fully legalized pot is a high priority for the government.
Okay, so I think a lot of us are wondering, what does legalization mean? Should the government actually move forward with this, Ed? Does it mean that someone with an ounce of pot in their pocket won't go to jail? Is that what that means?
Well, who knows what it means? And we don't know what it means because the government hasn't told us anything about it, other than campaigning on a promise to make it happen in some capacity or another. So what it could mean could be all sorts of different things. I mean, lots of people have suspicions on it. Some companies are already signing contracts on legislation that doesn't exist. That's recent news just in the last couple of weeks. So it's fascinating to me that everyone's all gung-ho, everyone's all ready to proceed, everyone's all ready to dive right into it. The government has given no hints whatsoever, really. I mean, we've seen some reports that have come out that have advised the government, but nothing from internal sources that say, here's the direction we're going to go and here's what we're going to do, or even when we're going to do it.
Yeah, Jody, let me go to you next. Were you happy with the recommendations that came out of the task force, and do you think that the government will heed that advice?
There were a few recommendations that I agreed with, such as the age limit of 18, although the Senate did say the age of 16 was good after years of study.
Would you be happy with the age of 16?
I think we need to talk about what cannabis really is and what it does and what young people are forced to use otherwise. But again, let's go back to what the Liberals are promising. At first, Trudeau was in favor of decriminalization and not legalization. He said that criminal records for young people cost money and hurt people. And then he's changed his message since to become mostly a prohibitionist message. When we had Harper as Prime Minister, the goal of prohibition was to restrict and limit access to marijuana, go after gangs, and protect the kids. Well, does that sound familiar to you? Because that's exactly what Trudeau is saying now. And he's also added he's not going to legalize for any other reason, not for jobs, not to protect Canadians who are criminalized, not for any other reason but to stop the gangs and protect the kids, which we know prohibition does not effectively address, and his form of legalization won't either. When you look at the potential for medical marijuana, yes, it would be wonderful to have a salve you can put on your burns and it'll grow your skin back. That's a reality for pharmaceutical industries. But when you look at recreational marijuana, you should be able to buy it just like you buy coffee and coffee beans or alcohol. You should be able to access it like a farmer's market sells.
I think most of us would like it to see it regulated as a regulated wellness product,
Sam?
rather than the same as an opiate.
We're sitting here in Zoomer Hall, and I'm looking at the audience, and you know, when you put up a bright red line between recreational use and medical use, you bring up the specter of teenagers who just want to get plastered. That's not the case of the people in this room. These are people who want to be able to access marijuana because they have aches and pains. They've got knees, they've got joints.
But it's the case that it's the case when we talk about someone at the age of 18 being able to go into an LCBO-like store to buy pot.
But I think it's absolutely wrong to try and produce some clear differentiation. There are lots of different reasons why people use it. People in the older demographic who are increasingly important, increasingly coming back to this medicine because it makes them feel better, because it gets rid of their aches and pains. And we have to acknowledge that if you just medicalize it and you teach people that the only way you can get this is if you've got cancer, we're cutting all these people out from the positive benefits.
But why legalize it if all of these people are using it for medicinal purposes? You say, what's the point of legalization if they can get their hands on it through the medical system?
Because it's extremely difficult under the current medical regime.
That's not a reason for legalization, right? If the question is you want to medicalize it, you want to make it accessible to people with a wide range of ailments and disorders, you can do that within the current medical regime. Not within the current medical marijuana regime, I agree. There's plenty of room for tweaking on how we currently provide medicinal marijuana to people. And I know there are companies and legislators working on that. But that doesn't say that it should be on the street like coffee, as Jody suggested. There's a big difference between coffee and marijuana.
But why can't we talk about two different markets and there are different uses? So there is a recreational value to cannabis, and I'm not opposed to it. But there's also a medical benefit to different forms of cannabis.
But that's why
pills.
There's this confusion right now that these licensed producers of medicine, medical marijuana, who can't even meet that need
for the recreational side, so even though I agree that there is a recreational market that we should be talking about, but it doesn't mean that the recreational market can be unregulated either. Right now, there's a lot of advocacy for recreational and freewheeling legalization that says we don't need those regulations.
Well, there's no victims from marijuana. Like, I know there's going to be some people who say, yes, marijuana may be a gateway drug, but let me just finish this. Marijuana is safer than coffee. Coffee is an addictive stimulant. Many people who use coffee use it every day and cannot work. They can't even talk to anybody.
Nobody's crashed their car on
coffee.
Well,
but distracted driving, you might be
that actually show that it is
It's not a hallucinogen.
It's classified as a hallucinogen.
I use it every day and I've never seen
You can't change the classification just because that works for you. It is classified as a hallucinogen. That's the classification.
The classification isn't correct. And let's talk about recreational. You're saying that this market that exists.
Clinical studies actually show that it is more addictive than caffeine.
I don't think that's true. It's habit forming if you choose to do that, but video games are just as addictive. You can say that it is safer than
alcohol. So if the pyramid, if the hierarchy is heroin, LSD, etc., you've got some serious dangerous drugs, you've got opiates, then you've got alcohol, then you've got cannabis.
I think we're making a huge categorical error in trying to say that the reason we legalize it is because we say that we promote it. We legalize it because prohibition has untold ills associated with it. If you keep it illegal, you can't educate people, you can't talk about dependency, you can't talk about some people run into problems with it, and you can't have an intelligent discussion of how it improves people's wellness. If you get it out of prohibition and you legalize it, then all of that is on the table for us to discuss.
Well, there is obviously a lot to discuss here, and I'm excited that we have a very fiery panel, but we're out of time for this segment. So, how young is too young for legal pot? We'll debate where to set the age limit as legalization looms. That's next.
There's kids that are 11 years old that are smoking marijuana, that have access to it, that have older brothers that, you know what, they're getting it from. And they're told repeatedly, there's nothing wrong with it.
Welcome back. Nearly 1 million Canadians who don't use marijuana now are likely to start after it's legalized. That, according to a forum poll conducted last year. But how much marijuana rises under legalization has in part to do with how it's priced and accessed. Now, let's go back to the first point. Are you concerned with the messaging that's being sent with legalization?
So when I go and I do lectures in high schools, and I go all the way down to grade 6 and talk to them, there's kids that are 11 years old that are smoking marijuana, that have access to it, that have older brothers that, you know what, they're getting it from. And they're told repeatedly, there's nothing wrong with it. With our government now going and saying there is absolutely nothing wrong with it, with the want of legalizing it and putting it out in the market, it scares me to the effect of how many younger individuals are now going to use that as an excuse to say, well, if I can do it on a street corner. It's no longer a problem.
When you legalize something, you reduce the stigma, so they say.
Yes.
And as a result, we saw that report that indicated that there will be nearly 1 million new users of pot in Canada. 900,000 was the actual number. Whether or not you think it's perfectly safe, or can you at least acknowledge that it's still something you're smoking, you're still inhaling certain carcinogens, and maybe encouraging 1 million people,
well, that's only
or opening the door.
That's only in one of its forms. There's vaporization, there's edibles, there's topicals, there's tinctures. There's a number of different ways to consume cannabis that most people don't know about. There are different strains. Part of that we've talked about is the education is key. The stigma, I actually, as a patient advocate, it's one of the most frustrating things for me, is I will be dealing with patients who have Crohn's disease and are facing surgeries that are going to require them to have feet of their intestine removed. And cannabis has been shown to be helpful with Crohn's disease, and there are these mothers that are refusing to even try it because it's illegal, because of the stigma of it being illegal. And when I ask them the question, if Trudeau legalized it tomorrow, would you try it? They're like, yeah, sure.
I don't think you could deny the differentiation between, if I were looking to try to go get a pill, okay, I wanted to get Tylenol 3, I wouldn't be buying that from the guy on the street corner either, and I wouldn't be buying it in gummy bear format, and I wouldn't be rolling my own Tylenol, as it were, and trying to design that in my bathtub. So if you're talking about it from the medicinal perspective,
my own ginger
no, but I don't think
nobody's
going to be hesitant in a scenario where they can walk into their Shoppers Drug Mart or their Rexall with a prescription from their doctor, and a pharmacist hands them, whether it's a joint or whether it's a brownie or whatever format it is, even if it is something that's a little bit more fun to take than cough syrup, but they hand them something that is genuinely a medicine, and it's packaged as a medicine and provided as a medicine. So I think we really are strongly blurring the lines between recreational and medicinal in our conversation.
I'm going back to the thing about the idea of it being a medicine and it being a wellness product.
Similar to eating a healthy diet.
But whether it's a drug like an opioid or whether it's a regulated wellness product. And I think that we need to look at it.
It's a regulated wellness product with mind-altering symptoms.
Well, vegetables and fruits. If you feed a child junk food, it's going to stunt their intellectual development, probably, as compared to an organic fresh food diet. But
we're not talking about candy bars. We're talking about a drug.
Cannabis, yes. But let me also add, for everyone who's concerned about smoke in the lungs, this is going to blow your mind, and I'm sorry to be like the pot person here, but the United States government asked Dr. Donald Tashkin, a pulmonary expert, to study cannabis and prove that it causes cancer, because they've been saying it and they want to prove it. And he studied it. He found that not only does cannabis smoke not cause cancer, but for people who smoke cigarettes, who also smoke cannabis, their likelihood of cancer goes down. Cannabis is actually
it's an expectorant.
It's an expectorant. It expands your lungs. You can, like, don't believe me.
It works.
It's 3 times the level of tar to a cigarette.
But it's expectorated. Do you understand what this means? Is that
Yes,
when you cough it up,
I do, but
it's clearing your lungs,
also inhibits the cilia and bronchial. Okay, it's proven exactly the opposite of what you're saying, and
Let's bring Sam in.
I was just going to say, you know, again, if things stay in a prohibition environment, then the only way, most of the way that people can get it is as the flower, and that means they're going to smoke it. And you two can have this debate about whether it is or whether it isn't, but individuals will decide for themselves. But right now, they can only get it as a flower. If you legalize it and regulate it, then there will be other forms, whether they're vape pens or gels and capsules and sublinguals, and people will have a choice. And then, if it's legalized, there will be a hell of a lot more medical research, which has been virtually impossible to do.
And frankly, drug dealers don't ask for ID. That's the simplest part. It needs to be legalized because drug dealers do not ask for ID.
But speaking about eliminating the black market, who's to say the black market, Ed, will be eliminated? From your legal perspective, obviously a lot of what this will come down to is the cost. When you tax, when you regulate, we saw this with cigarettes, so who's to say that the black market for marijuana will?
If the government, whatever number they're going to come up with, and we know government wants to get their hands on the enormous amount of money. We saw the Colorado numbers, we've seen the underground market numbers now. So anybody who's got any interest in helping government take a little less of my money and a little more of somebody else's wants to get a handle on this. But those dollars, the question is going to be how high are they going to set that tax rate? So if the black market is going to be substantially cheaper, and I don't know what substantial means, but let's use that term vaguely now, but if it's substantially cheaper, then a large percentage of people are still going to go to the black market. We've seen it with cigarettes where there's a certain point at taxation levels that people just say, screw it, I'm going to go get the illegal cigarettes. And that's what they will continue to do with marijuana if they pick the wrong number. So we've got to be very careful about when government wants to get its greedy mitts on it, how much can it take before distorting that market?
I'm concerned about that as well because in states like California, when they started legalizing recreational use, the price of a medicinal ounce went up quite a bit. So the price for patients increased.
State of Washington initially came out with a 37% tax and got very little uptake. They changed that to a much lower tax level, and the Parliamentary Budget Office has advised the government to legalize it, to deal with the other ills of prohibition, not to enrich their coffers.
Okay, lots to disagree on. When we return, we'll discuss medicinal marijuana and its benefits to thousands of Canadians with specific health concerns. But is there an issue surrounding its recreational use and possible abuse? That's next.
And I also was on antidepressants. I was on those pills, and they were bad for me. And I had to take 2 years of weaning off, and cannabis saved my life.
Welcome back. There are over 70,000 patients across Canada approved for marijuana to treat over 168 recognized conditions. Our Zed News cameras caught up with some users and manufacturers to help understand the benefits of medical pot.
We produce what we call a pharmaceutical-grade medical cannabis with 281 points of quality control in what's called a GMP-rated facility, or meaning good manufacturing practices.
We've now recorded over 168 conditions that the physicians have prescribed medical cannabis for today. Under the old program, while we were started with Health Canada in 2000 and for a period of time till 2014, a patient had to have one of 8 conditions like arthritis or cancer. Now we can see it's 168 conditions.
I use cannabis medicinally to treat the side effects of type 1 diabetes. It gives me an appetite, it helps control my pain, a number of different benefits that way. But one of the other conditions I don't talk to people about is I also have PTSD. When we start talking about military personnel and stuff, PTSD is something that cannabis is very, very helpful with.
What you're seeing here is my Parkinson's tremor with absolutely no medication whatsoever. Okay, it's now 20 minutes since I self-medicated with approximately 30 milligrams of marijuana.
Many of our members are looking for ways of pain relief. Knowing that marijuana is now legal gives them some comfort. Popular presenters at our chapters have been CannaMed with their medical marijuana information.
Tracy, let me go to you because we just saw that video and you were in it. How has medical marijuana helped you with your PTSD?
8 years ago, I found myself in a crisis and found myself with a PTSD diagnosis and looked at my physician and said, give me drugs. Give me pharmaceuticals. I need to figure out a way out of this. I need treatment. But I also knew that the pharmaceutical meds weren't going to be a long-term solution. So I started looking at the strains of cannabis that I was using and started looking at PTSD and cannabis use through military personnel and have found that I am able to get rid of I'm rid of my daily antidepressant and my daily anti-anxiety medications.
As we look toward a market where pot is legalized for recreational use, will there be a difference between medical and recreational?
Well, there's preventative use is something we should also talk about, like for medical reasons.
But is medical pot different than recreational pot?
It's basically the same plant.
Actually, I'm going to disagree with that slightly. So what happens in the black market, in the recreational market that we see is a lot of the black market growers are growing indicas, which is a type of marijuana, and they grow quickly, they grow larger yields, they're shorter plants, so they're easier to hide in basements. So that's what you actually see on the recreational market, and it's more of a depressant than a stimulant. I'm very lucky. I'm a licensed medical marijuana user. I have a designated grower that grows for me, and he grows sativas, which are uplifting and energizing. And it's a different type of marijuana that I have access to because I have a legal grower who it doesn't matter how high his ceilings are, it doesn't matter whether or not he's caught growing it because he has legal access too.
What I do know when it comes to PTSD, when it comes to anxiety or any of these other things as well, is the first thing that we have to do is we need, and this is, my field is counseling and therapy.
Oh, of course.
Without the counseling and therapy, no amount of drugs out there are going to give you any kind of help. We're simply just masking.
Cannabis, the reason we don't know much, we don't know what strains, all this, blame prohibition, blame the government policy that forced it to hide underground. And then secondly, we need to talk about the preventative effects of cannabis. The fact that we know it prevents the calcification of parts of your brain that lead to Alzheimer's. And I also was on antidepressants. I was on those pills, and they were bad for me. And I had to take 2 years of weaning off, and cannabis saved my life. And right now, those very same pills are on TV, and it says, take this antidepressant. You might kill yourself, you might die of a few different ailments, and meanwhile, cannabis, which is a safer choice, and when we say we don't have evidence, anecdotally, we do. We have decades of millions of people using marijuana. But you can look, there's no marijuana victims dying on the street, there's no marijuana cases.
But there certainly, there certainly are, okay. And I think that we all agree at this table that for medicinal purposes, marijuana works.
Yes, absolutely. Works for me.
But there's also a wealth of research. There's a wealth of research also showing links between schizophrenia, certain psychoses, and it's not, and I'm not saying it causes it.
There's correlation.
I'm saying perhaps it unmasks it. But can we, at the very least, acknowledge that this is a barrier to legalization and something we need to take very seriously?
One note, and I'll just say it shortly for everyone.
Sam.
The research on schizophrenia and psychosis is quite extensive, and it's also quite clear. What it says is that cannabis does not cause schizophrenia. What it says is that there are shared vulnerabilities that lead people to begin doing a number of things that are bad for them, that are indicia of coming problems. Those include excessive alcohol use, cannabis use, smoking, poor performance in schools, and you're gonna kick in with 5 other things I've forgotten. And that those things are a shared vulnerability.
I agree with you 100%, and I think that is sort of where we have this, this shelf where people can't get on the same page. If marijuana advocates would at least say, here are the negatives, people might buy in a little bit more, but all that you hear in general public is all of the positive, all of the great, all of the great.
That's because there's been demonization for so long, and it's been nothing but lies.
So now if we want to legalize, let's talk about all of the negative potential side effects.
And they're so minor.
There's miles of them. Okay, there are miles of them.
Not compared to the benefits of it. Because when you scare people about reefer madness that'll make your teenager go insane, you're actually preventing people from choosing a safer alternative for medicine, a safer alternative for enjoyable recreation. So instead of drinking as a 16-year-old, smoking pot
How about not doing any of it.
I can tell you, parents would much rather their kids be smoking pot, playing video games, than at a keg party where there's a bunch of people under the influence of alcohol.
Except they're doing both, Jody.
Except they're doing both.
That's the reality.
And that's a
they go
bad
to the keg
idea.
Party,
They should
have a beer in one hand and a joint in the other.
And we need to educate them honestly, because if you lie to them about marijuana like I was lied to, I did go on and try all the other hard drugs. I did have problems.
I've been lecturing in high
quit.
schools now for 10 years, okay? And I don't look like a police officer walking in there. I don't look like a doctor or a lawyer or any of these that are walking in there.
You haven't seen my sleeves
You probably have them underneath there as well.
A little like a cop,
right?
a little, yeah.
I look like the average individual walking in there and somebody that they can actually talk to. I kick the teachers out. I kick all the authority out of the room, and I have a real discussion with kids about drugs. And I give them the real information about drugs.
Of your experience of it?
Of the reality of what drugs are.
What is the reality? Because coffee and alcohol are drugs. Cheese is kind of a drug too.
Anything's a mere mind-altering substance is classified as a drug. So
sugar.
I'm not going to go down all of those kind of paths, but I give them the reality of what they are. And to be honest, and it's probably a horrible thing to say, I don't care whether they use or they don't use, but they need the information about what the potential consequences may be. And I say potential because it's not everybody. Not everybody is going to become an addict.
Did you used to smoke pot?
Oh, absolutely.
Were you addicted?
Absolutely.
And did it lead to other drugs?
It led to every other drug known to man.
Did you try alcohol first, or coffee, or mother's milk, or candy?
No.
Cheese?
A gateway drug is a drug that leads you to another drug because it loosens up your mind. If you smoke marijuana, period, okay, if we can get past this and just at least accept this, I'm not saying it leads to other drugs, but if we can accept the fact that if a 16, 15-year-old smokes a drug, that he's now more inclined to say, well, drugs, it wasn't that bad, maybe I'll try another drug.
You know, I'm not here as an advocate or a patient advocate saying that marijuana is for everyone and everyone should smoke it. What I'm saying is it's freedom of choice.
But by that argument, what about other drugs? Should we legalize heroin?
And prohibition, absolutely.
It's a healthcare issue, it's not an enforcement
Let
issue.
me just say that we already give kids Ritalin, which is amphetamine.
We should legalize heroin.
No,
should we legalize crack?
You shouldn't know.
Should we legalize all of those drugs?
We need to see what does legalize mean.
Them all so they're safe, yes.
What does legalize mean is all the big
There's nothing safe about injecting heroin.
There's nothing.
Tell that to people at Insight who have saved 300 people's
lives.
No,
come on. That doesn't make it safe. Okay, I'm very familiar with
it safer.
It makes somebody live for the next day when they take another shot of heroin until the moment there's somebody not beside them and they die.
Where is your war on alcohol?
We have gotten way
off track.
Because they're two different camps. Honestly,
I don't think
while it's really important to talk about teenagers, I think we're missing the main story. There's broad agreement, not universal agreement, but broad agreement that young teenagers should not be allowed to access this. Whether the age is 18 or 21, well, our government will figure that out. But the discussion has got to come back to the legal access for adults who can make their own decisions, and how much better it is to have legal, safe access to this than to have the current environment of prohibition.
Okay, when we return, Colorado topped $1 billion in legal marijuana sales in 2016. Just how profitable could Canada's industry be? Stay tuned.
The only reason there's medical marijuana in this country is because dispensaries and patients and growers were arrested and charged and paid lawyers, and they were demonized and they won. And the court said you have to provide marijuana.
So is that why you continue to open dispensaries?
Absolutely, because the only way to change this law is to break this law.
Welcome back. There are reports of this industry coming in at around $22 billion from the recreational sale alone. Factoring in taxes, licensing fees, and weed-related tourism, the market could be even greater. Sam, the numbers are astounding. And I have to go to you first because you are personally invested in the medical marijuana market. At what point did you realize that this might be a good industry, the medical, the legal industry, to invest in?
I started looking at it seriously in 2013, and it was right at the time that the Canadian government was putting forward a program that would eventually become the MMPR program, and it was right at the time that the U.S. was getting ready for some referenda that changed things there. And, you know, from a purely economic point of view, getting away from all the moral discussions we've had about prohibition and all that, What attracted me was that this is not about creating a new market. I spent my life as a tech investor. You know, you'd go out, you'd invent some new widget, you'd hope that someone would wear it a few years later. Sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. Here it was a case of taking an existing market, converting it from illegal use to legal use. I've got to quibble a little bit with the numbers you put forward. That $22 billion reflects all kinds of follow-on economic activity.
That was a Deloitte study, just
I know,
so
and it doesn't reflect the actual retail size of the market. It's everyone who's servicing the market, every lawyer, venture capitalist, advisor.
Don't let the lawyers out, Sam.
The numbers themselves are very impressive nonetheless. The typical numbers that you hear is that it's going to be something on the order of $5 billion within the first couple of years after adult use kicks in, and probably settle in at $7 or $8 billion. And that's very much the same scaled as what's going on in the US. Colorado, last year, 1.2 billion. They have a population of 5.5 billion. We have a population of 35.5 billion. We're roughly seven times the size. All kinds of other studies suggesting that that's the scale.
Well, but any discussion of market size, you can't ignore the shift from other pharmaceutical drugs into cannabis-based drugs. So if you're talking about the $22 billion worldwide pain market, as you see the prescription, or right now cannabis would be a 5th or 6th line therapy, opiates would be up higher. As that shift occurs, opiates come down because we know of all the problems associated with that, and cannabis rises on that scale. You'll see a shift into cannabis.
Yeah, people who are invested in pharmaceutical industries have been pushing. For example, in Arizona, they voted on legalization, and the makers of fentanyl spent $5 million, I think it was, to try and defeat legalization because they knew that their profits would go down.
There are a lot of economic benefits associated with this. We're in a very unique moment here. We're going to be the second country to nationalize, to legislate, legalize it from a federal level. We are the first one to do it. That's a major Western economic power. And we happen to be doing this at a moment where the U.S., because of the Trump administration, looks like they're going backwards from a lot of progress.
And by the way, I think it's important to note that, because as a lawyer, people often ask me, they talk about this gray area. And again, I've sort of said to the panelists when we were off air, I'm marijuana agnostic. I don't really care one way or the other. I'm neither for or against. I'm in favor of smart legislation, regardless of what that legislation is designed to do. We've got to do it properly. But when you look south of the border, people should be aware it's still illegal now in Canada, and it's absolutely illegal in the U.S., including in Colorado, federally speaking.
This is about an industry in which people have literally been hunted down, demonized, had their children taken, they lose their job, they lose their scholarship. And so when we're talking about harms that are caused and about why we need to legalize... But let's say if coffee was illegal tomorrow,
coffee isn't
But it's not.
But the law is unjust.
But you need
just
to
because you don't like the law, though, doesn't mean that you
Sitting
can't
at the front
abide
of the
by the
bus
law.
used to be illegal.
You still need
Civil disobedience.
But to his point, to Keith's point, I'll let him speak. Just because you don't like the law doesn't mean you can't abide by it.
Well, some people don't. Some people do abide by it, like we know. But some people, like Henry Morgentaler, who was honored at Idea City, he won the Order of Canada. Why? Because he opened up shops and said, I'm going to provide abortions whether you like it or not. I'm going to break the law.
Jody, we are this close. We are this close to legalization.
Only because of people breaking the law, changing the law, going to court. The only reason there's medical marijuana in this country is because dispensaries and patients and growers were arrested and charged and paid lawyers, and they were demonized, and they won. And the court said you have to provide
So
marijuana.
is that why you continue to open dispensaries?
Absolutely, because the only way to change this law is to break this law.
I was going to say, Ed is oversimplifying the black and white of being legal or illegal. In the
I don't
US,
think I am, with all due respect.
For example, in the U.S., it is true, it's federally illegal. It's also true, Congress has passed a law for the last 4 years, the Rohr-Farbacher Amendment, which prevents the DEA from spending any federal budgeted money to prosecute in states that have legalized it in a well-established framework. You're ignoring the fact that the states are at war with the federal government. In Canada, certain cities, such as the city of Vancouver, have basically said, we don't care, feds. we are putting our own legal protective umbrella.
Now, again, so the suggestion that that's a gray market is, but I think people have to understand, we do a disservice when on a show like this with an audience that people are going to watch, we suggest that there's anything gray about it. They may or may not get arrested, but it is illegal. And when we suggest that they can cross the board...
That is exactly why it's gray.
No, you may or may not get arrested for running the red light outside of our studio today also, but it's still illegal, so don't do it. Unless you want to be a client of mine, I'm perfectly happy to do that.
I'll explain to you what I mean when I say that.
There are consequences to civil disobedience.
There are, and we accept them and we change them. And the fact that marijuana legalization is happening is because people sacrificed and suffered, like my husband who spent 5 years in a prison in a country he never went to, strictly for legalization activism. Our people, our community, our culture has been here for decades, and I've been demonized. We're second-class citizens. You can't travel to the U.S. Like, literally, everyone's looking at this as an economic thing, and they go, oh, yeah, I guess there's a civil liberties aspect, too, but there's nothing else.
Well, he didn't give it away for free. He was making money also, and I appreciate
and the
that.
money was used directly for court cases. The money was used for court cases. The DEA said he had $11 in his bank account. He gave it all away, and he did. He had nothing when he went to prison, and I suffered and struggled for years, campaigning, marching, running for office, running my business, waiting every day, wondering which one of my friends is going to get arrested next.
But let's recognize that in Canada, we actually are at the forefront of this. So I know that there's a lot of impatience because you guys have been at the forefront of fighting the battles, and it's rewarded, and I hear that. But recognize that Canada is the market leader in cannabis. It is.
All right. Well, when we return, we'll hear from our audience. Don't go away.
How can we, all of us, especially from my generation, remove that stigma that it's all about the high, because it's not.
Welcome back. We'll hear from our audience now, and we're starting with Mary. Mary, how are you?
I'm good because of medical cannabis. Last year, I was in a car accident. Up until that point in time, I was incredibly healthy, but it stopped me, and I was on a lot of opioids for pain. I'm still in recovery. I'm still in therapy. I have been fortunate enough to find a clinic where a psychiatrist is scripting with great knowledge. So I am using it for pain. I have no psychothermic effect, and the opioid use is gone. How can we, all of us, especially from my generation, remove that stigma that it's all about the high, because it's not. How do we do it?
But there are companies working on strains of marijuana that don't have the psychotropic effect at all.
Well, that's what I'm taking. I'm taking an oil.
Right. So I think people need to understand that when you talk about education and when you talk about medicinal use, if you're not there for the high, you don't need the high. You can go there for a medicine.
But what's wrong with feeling good when you're sick,
that my doctor
too?
gives me.
Should we add that people
It's a
are...
different question. It's not the question that was posed, and I think it's a different regulatory regime, and I think there are very different considerations.
Depending on what you're treating will be dependent upon whether or not you need that high, and that's something that you learn from education, you learn from strains, and as we get more information out there by the strains that are being developed by different companies and the strains that are being developed by different growers, I think as we start information sharing on a subject that has been very secretive for decades and decades, I think that that's actually going to help.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you for taking my question.
All right. Well, it's time for a short break. As we leave you, here are some of the things you had to say about past episodes of theZoomer.
On our Facebook page, Lee Robinson writes, "Wow, love your show. theZoomer, you're on fire. You have backbone. You're helping those of us who are oppressed. God bless you. Keep up the good work. Big hugs." In the Twitter universe, James says, "The DIY downsizing episode was very insightful. At theZoomer TV. Love the variety on the program." By email, Amy writes, "I was an audience participant at the taping of the Seniors and Downsizing show. I understand that it was shown on March 3rd. How can I get a copy of a video of the show?" Thank you for your question, Amy. You can find full episodes and info about future tapings by going to www.thezoomertv.com. We're always interested in your comments, so keep them coming in.
Welcome back. We'll hear final thoughts from our panelists now, starting with you, Jody.
Well, as we talk about legalization, there are a lot of different subjects, as we've touched on, but I just want everyone to remember why we're legalizing it. It's not just to make money on the stock market. It's not to scare people about pot. It's the fact that for many, many decades, millions of Canadians have been arrested and charged and denied their freedom and their civil liberties under prohibition. Prohibition as a policy is wrong, and we need to legalize it and recognize that this is a civil rights issue, and many people have suffered for it, and we need reparations or at least an apology.
Canada has an incredible and unique opportunity. We're going to be the first significant Western country to have a legalized adult use throughout the whole country. And we shouldn't shy away from that. We shouldn't be scared because the path is not exactly known. There are lots of examples in other jurisdictions that have gone part of the way in parts of the US and in other parts of other countries. We had to look at those examples, take the best of them, institute them here, and move into the future and legalize this and get rid of prohibition.
Policy, education are going to play a key part in how Canadians experience cannabis, and I encourage everybody to do their own research. And as far as a medical advocate, I encourage everyone not to just take your doctor's word for it or this panel's word for it, but take control of your own health care. Not all doctors got A's in school, so you need to actually take responsibility for yourselves and your own education.
I think there's a lot more to do on reframing the conversation between dangerous drugs but it's not a benign drug either. So it's somewhere in between. I think at the next stage we need to bring about a safety which includes good products, standardized meter dosing, and legislation, regulations to give you good quality products.
So legalization is coming. Obviously, that makes somebody like me concerned, not because I care about that, but just from a business perspective, right? So I think legalization is the right thing to do. It's going to come. There's going to be regulation. It's not going to be a free-for-all whether you want it to be or not. The government's simply not going to allow that. So there's going to be all sorts of layers of regulation on top of this. We're going to have to learn to deal with that. And that will undoubtedly create more business for lawyers like myself. But the one issue we haven't touched is the question of impaired driving, driving while stoned, driving while high. That's going to be the most complicated one, I think, to deal with. And I can tell you the criminal courts are absolutely terrified about how we're going to deal with this, what it's going to do to our courts, how we're going to get answers.
I'm in fear of legalization, not for the medical purposes, not for people that need it to help them with pain, to help them with symptoms, but I'm worried about the message that it gets to our youth, the hands that it gets into, and the overwhelming thought and or belief that there's nothing wrong with it and it has no ill side effects. It has tremendous side effects that need to be recognized, that need to be told to our youth, and that need to be explained constantly so they understand if they choose to do it, here are the possible consequences that might happen. It does not happen to everybody, but you need to know. Just like taking, any kind of medication, period, here are the real and legitimate side effects that might happen, and it might only happen from taking it the very first time.
All right. Thank you to my panel, to my audience in studio, and to those of you at home. It's time to zoom out.